The rope had cut through Layla's wrists 2 days ago, and now every step she took opened the wound fresh, a thin red line sliding down her palm and dripping onto the frozen dirt of the execution road. 19 Omega prisoners walked in a single chain toward Thornfall Field, and Layla was number 9, caught between an old man whose breath rattled like a loose door in the wind, and a girl barely 13 whose cheeks had frozen mid-cry. She could smell everything around her. That was the curse of it. Not just the copper taste of her own blood, or the sour sweat of bodies pressed too close together in the line, but underneath all of it, the sharp bite of pine crushed under marching boots, the cold stone smell of the river they had crossed at dawn, and far-off wood smoke from a village where someone was cooking a meal she would never taste. Her stomach twisted so hard she nearly fell, and the chain dragged the old man forward with her. He didn't complain. He had stopped complaining a full day ago. Soldiers lined both sides of the road, more soldiers than Layla had ever seen in one place. She had heard of Alpha King George Stapleton since she was a child, back when she still had a pack, back when people still used her name instead of just calling her Omega, like it was the only word she deserved. They called him the Unbroken King, ruler of 5 territories stitched together through war, and if the stories were true, through a kind of control so complete that even his enemies admired it before he crushed them. His soldiers stood in rows of black armor that swallowed the pale winter light. She could feel their wolves underneath their human skin, pressing against her senses like a hand closing slowly around her throat. That should not have been possible. Omegas could not sense rank or dominance. That was one of the many things wrong with Layla, one of the many reasons her old pack handed her to the border court with a list of charges long enough to make her almost laugh. Practicing medicine without permission, refusing an arranged mating, suspected use of a forbidden bloodline gift, teaching Omega children letters they were never supposed to learn. That last charge was the one that sealed her fate. She had taught 6 children to read using scraps of bark and a stick of burnt charcoal, and for that, her own pack Alpha had signed the paper that sent her here. The execution march was not quick. King Stapleton's justice, she had been told, was carried out in public so every border pack would remember who ruled them. Each prisoner would kneel at Thornfall Field. Each would have their crime read aloud. Each would be given one chance to beg before the blade came down. Layla had decided 3 days ago that she would not beg. She had also decided, somewhere between the second night and this freezing morning, that she would not go quietly either. A sound had been building inside her chest for 2 days now. Not a song she had ever learned, but something older, something that lived in her bones and only rose to the surface when death stood close enough to touch. It came in a language she had never studied but somehow understood, the same way she understood how to set a broken bone without training, the same way she knew which roots stopped bleeding and which ones started a stopped heart again. Her mother used to sing something like it very quietly, very late at night, and always with the door locked. Layla had never asked why. Now she wished she had. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The old man's name was Rick. He told her on the first night, when the guards weren't listening, in a whisper so thin it barely carried between them. I had a bakery, he said. 40 years. Bread for 3 villages. He smiled like the memory still tasted sweet. They said I sold bread to Omegas after curfew. That was my crime. Layla had looked at his hands, cracked and flour-white even now, even in chains, and something in her chest went soft and furious at the same time. You didn't deserve this, she told him. Neither did you, Rick said. Neither did any of us. The girl on her other side, Nancy, hadn't spoken a single word since the march began. Layla had checked her wrists each night, cleaning them with melted snow when the guards looked away, because habits didn't die just because the world had decided you were worthless. She had been a healer's assistant once, trained under Jude before her own pack turned on her, and some things stayed in the hands even when everything else had been taken. By the 3rd morning, the chain reached the gates of Thornfall Field, a wide stretch of frozen ground ringed by black stone walls and a crowd of soldiers standing at attention. At the center of the field stood a raised platform, and on it, a man in a dark cloak lined with wolf fur, a crown of iron and gold sitting heavy on his head. King George Stapleton did not look like the monster the stories described. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent so many years being feared that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be looked at. Beside him stood a broader man in polished commander's armor. Commander Lopez, arms crossed, eyes scanning the line of prisoners with the flat patience of someone who had done this many times before. And near the edge of the platform, a thinner man held a scroll of names, his mouth already curling into the shape of the first charge. His name, Layla would learn soon enough, was Geoffrey Farrell, the king's chief enforcer, a man who took pride in reading death sentences the way other men took pride in poetry. "Bring forward prisoner one," Farrell called, and the line moved. One by one, the prisoners were dragged to the platform. One by one, their crimes were read. Most begged. A few didn't. The blade came down regardless. Layla watched Rick go still beside her as prisoner after prisoner knelt in the churned snow. She watched Nancy's frozen tears finally start moving again, sliding fresh down her face. When they called Prisoner 9, the guards yanked the chain, and Layla stumbled forward into the open field, in front of every soldier, in front of the king himself. Farrell unrolled the scroll and read her charges aloud, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. When he reached the last line, teaching Omega children to read, a ripple moved through the watching soldiers, not amusement, something closer to discomfort. "Kneel," Farrell ordered. Layla did not kneel. "I said kneel." "I heard you," Layla said, and her voice, quiet as it was, seemed to carry farther than it should have. "I am not going to beg for something I'm not sorry for." A murmur went through the crowd. Farrell's hand moved toward the guard beside him, ready to force her down. And that was when the sound Layla had been carrying in her chest for 3 days finally broke free. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a song, not exactly. It rose out of her in the old language, low and rolling, and the moment it left her mouth, something impossible happened. Every wolf on that field, soldier and commander and king alike, went still. Not the frozen stillness of fear. Something deeper. Something instinctual. One by one, from the back rows to the front, soldiers who had never once yielded on a battlefield sank slowly to their knees in the snow, as if their own bodies had stopped taking orders from their minds. Commander Lopez went down first, disbelief written across his face even as his knee hit the frozen ground. Farrell went down mid-sentence, the scroll falling from his hand. And at the front of the platform, King George Stapleton, a man who had never knelt to anyone in his adult life, felt his own legs fold beneath him, his crown tilting forward as his head bowed. Layla stopped singing, stunned by her own voice, and the silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Slowly, the king lifted his head and looked at her, not with the anger she braced for, but with something far more dangerous. Curiosity. "Rise," he said to his men, though his voice shook slightly, an unfamiliar sound coming from a man whose voice had never shaken in front of an army before. Soldiers scrambled up, confused, some rubbing their knees like they'd been struck. The king stepped down from the platform himself, walking through the parted soldiers until he stood directly in front of Layla, close enough that she could see the questions building behind his eyes. "What are you?" he asked. "A healer," Layla said. "Apparently also a criminal." A faint, unwilling twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Apparently," he said. "You're something the old bloodline songs used to warn kings about." He turned to Farrell, still shaking snow off his knees. "Release the chain. Your Majesty, the charges have just become the least interesting thing that's happened at Thornfall Field in a decade," the king said. "Release them. All of them." The healer's wing of the palace smelled like dried lavender and boiled linen, and it was the first place in 3 days that Layla could breathe without tasting blood in the air. Dr. Edmund, the king's royal physician, a small round man with careful hands and sharper eyes, cleaned her wrists himself instead of leaving it to an assistant. "Whatever you did out there," he said, wrapping fresh linen around her arm. "Half my patients this morning came in with sore knees and no memory of falling. You want to explain that to me?" "I don't understand it myself," Layla admitted. "Convenient. Edmund said, though not unkindly. Well, the king wants to see you once you're patched up. Try not to make anyone else kneel on the way there. My knees can't take another shock like that. Rick and Nancy had been given a room in the healer's wing as well, both recovering from the march, both alive because of a sound Layla still didn't understand. She sat with them for a while before the summons came, letting Rick tell her about the bakery again, letting Nancy finally speak her first real sentence in days. "Thank you," Nancy whispered. "You don't have to thank me," Layla said. "None of us should have been out there in the first place." When the guard came to take her to the king, she expected a throne room, cold stone, judgment. Instead, she was led to a smaller study lined with old books, a fire crackling in the corner, and George Stapleton sitting not on a throne but in a plain wooden chair, his crown set aside on the desk like it was just another piece of furniture. "Sit," he said. Layla sat, keeping her spine straight, refusing to let the last 3 days show on her face. "The old bloodline songs," George said, without preamble, "speak of a voice that was given to a handful of Omega healers generations ago, a gift meant to calm dying soldiers on the battlefield, to force even angry wolves into peace long enough to be treated. Most kings assumed it was a myth invented by healers to make themselves sound important. I didn't know I had it until 3 days ago," Layla said honestly. "My mother used to hum something like it at night. She never explained why." "Where is your mother now?" "Dead. For years." Layla kept her voice even. "My pack said grief made her unstable. They exiled her before she died. I never got the full story." Something shifted behind George's eyes, a flicker of recognition he didn't explain yet. "I'd like you to stay in the palace," he said instead. "Not as a prisoner, as a guest, and if you're willing, as a healer under Dr. Edmund's staff. And if I say no, then I'll have a carriage prepared and you can go wherever you'd like, with an armed escort for your protection, since half my army now knows your face and there are people who won't be pleased about what happened at Thornfall Field." Layla studied him. He wasn't lying. That, more than anything, was what convinced her to stay. "I'll stay," she said. "For now." "For now," George agreed, and for the first time since she'd seen him on that platform, something like a real smile touched his mouth. "Welcome to Stapleton Dominion, Layla." Not everyone in the palace shared the king's curiosity. Alpha Roger Cannon, a broad-shouldered lord from the Eastern Territory, made his opinion known within a week. He cornered Layla in the palace gardens on a gray afternoon, his sister Crystal Cannon a step behind him, arms folded, watching Layla the way a hunter watches a snare. "An Omega criminal in the royal healer's wing," Roger said, tone smooth as poured oil. "Tell me, what exactly did you promise the king to earn that kind of mercy?" "Nothing," Layla said. "He asked questions. I answered them." "How touching." Crystal's smile didn't reach her eyes. "My brother has spent 15 years advising this crown. I'd hate to see his counsel replaced by a girl who sings soldiers onto their knees." "I didn't ask anyone to kneel." "And yet they did," Roger said. "Which is exactly the problem, isn't it? A gift like that, in the wrong hands, could turn an entire army against its own king without a single sword drawn." There was truth buried in his warning, sharp enough that Layla felt it land. "I have no interest in turning anyone against anyone," she said. "See that you don't," Roger said, and walked away with Crystal close behind, the threat left hanging in the cold air like frost. Jude found her minutes later, sitting alone on a stone bench, her hands still trembling slightly. Jude had been a healer's assistant in another life too, before an injury cost him his position, and something in his cautious kindness made him easy to trust. "Roger Cannon doesn't threaten people for no reason," Jude said, sitting beside her. "He's been pushing the king toward war with the Northern Pacts for 2 years. An Omega who can drop an entire battlefield to its knees without violence doesn't fit his plans." "What plans?" Jude hesitated. "I've heard things. Nothing I can prove yet. But keep your eyes open, Layla. Not everyone in this palace wants you here, and not everyone wants the war Roger's been chasing to stop." Weeks passed, and the palace slowly stopped feeling like a cage. Layla worked alongside Dr. Edmund each morning, learning the palace's healing methods, teaching a few of her own in return. The same careful hands that once treated Omegas in secret now treating soldiers openly, without anyone questioning her right to do it. Rick found work in the palace kitchens, filling the air with the smell of fresh bread again. And Nancy trained under Edmund's guidance, slowly becoming the healer she'd always wanted to be. George found reasons to visit the healer's wing more often than his schedule required. At first it was questions about the bloodline gift, about her mother's exile, about the old songs. Slowly, the questions turned into something else. Evening walks along the palace walls, quiet conversations that had nothing to do with kingdoms or crowns. "You don't act like a king when it's just us," Layla told him one evening, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. "That's because being a king is exhausting," George admitted. 5 territories, each one convinced the others get better treatment. Half my council wants war with the North. The other half wants to marry me off to whichever territory offers the best trade deal. He glanced at her sideways. "None of them have asked what I want." "What do you want?" "I used to think I wanted peace for the kingdom," George said. "Lately I've started wondering if I want something smaller than that. Quieter." Layla felt her pulse pick up in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Careful, Your Majesty. That sounds dangerously close to a confession." "Maybe it is," George said, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. It was Dr. Edmund, oddly enough, who gave Layla the answer to the question that had followed her since Thornfall Field. Late one night, sorting through old palace records, he found a healer's log from 20 years ago, listing a woman named Barbara who had served the crown briefly before vanishing from the records entirely. "Barbara," Layla repeated, staring at the faded page. "That was my mother's name." Edmund's face went pale. "She served this palace, Layla, before your father's pack took her in. The log says she was dismissed after a battlefield incident where her voice, and I'm reading this exactly as written, brought 3 companies of soldiers to their knees mid-charge. The same gift, the same bloodline." Layla sat down slowly, the pieces finally arranging themselves into something whole. Her mother hadn't just carried a secret. She had carried this exact gift, used it once to save lives, and paid for it with exile and silence for the rest of her days. "She never told me," Layla whispered. "She let me think I was broken instead of telling me what I actually was." "Maybe she was trying to protect you," Edmund said gently, "from people exactly like Roger Cannon." The threat Jude had warned about finally showed its face at the edge of winter. Shawn Battles, warlord of the fractured Northern Territories, had spent years gathering scattered fighters into a single army, and his scouts had been spotted crossing into Stapleton land 3 times in a single month. Commander Lopez brought the reports to the king personally, spreading maps across the study desk while Roger Cannon stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, waiting for his moment. "Shawn Battles wants the eastern passes," Lopez said. "If he takes them, he controls every trade route into the Dominion. We need to move before he does." "War," Roger said, stepping forward. "Finally, someone in this room is speaking sense." "There's a difference between defense and war," George said evenly. "I want the border reinforced. I don't want thousands of soldiers dying for land Shawn Battles hasn't even taken yet." "With respect, Your Majesty," Roger pressed. "Your new healer's little trick at Thornfall Field proved something dangerous. If her voice can drop an army to its knees, imagine what it could do standing on our side of a real battlefield. Use her, and this war ends in a single afternoon." Layla, standing quietly near the door where she'd been summoned to report on Nancy's training, felt every eye in the room turn toward her. "I'm not a weapon," she said. "You're whatever the crown decides you are," Roger said, though his voice earned him a sharp look from George. "She decides that," George said. "Not you, not me, not this council. If Layla chooses to help defend this kingdom, it will be her choice, not an order." Roger's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, though Crystal, watching from the doorway, wore an expression that promised the conversation was far from finished. That night, Layla found Jude waiting near the healer's wing, his face grim in the candlelight. "I finally got proof," he said quietly, pressing a folded letter into her hand. "Roger's been in contact with Shawn Battles for months. He's not trying to stop the war, Layla. He's trying to control how it ends, so he can take the throne once the dust settles." The letter changed everything. Layla brought it to George that same night, her hands steady despite the storm building in her chest. He read it twice in silence, his expression darkening with every line. "He's been feeding Shawn Battles our patrol schedules," George said finally. "For months. My own advisor." "Jude found it," Layla said. "He's been watching Roger for weeks. And Crystal." The letters mention her too. She's been the one carrying messages between the eastern estate and the northern camps. George set the letter down, his hands braced against the desk, and for a moment Layla saw not a king but a man realizing how close betrayal had come to his own front door. "If I move against Roger now, without absolute proof his own council will accept, it looks like I'm silencing him because he questioned using you as a weapon," George said. "Shawn Battles wins either way. Chaos in my court or war on my border. Then we get proof his council can't argue with," Layla said. "Let Roger think his plan is working. Let him bring Shawn Battles to a meeting he thinks is private. And what do we do when he does?" Layla met his eyes. "I stop the battle before it starts. The same way I stopped Thornfall Field." George studied her for a long moment, worry and something warmer moving across his face at once. "That's a risk I don't want you taking." "It's not your risk to take or refuse," Layla said gently. "It's mine, and I'm choosing it." He reached across the desk and took her hand, careful of the fading scars still marking her wrists. "Then I'm choosing to stand beside you when it happens." Commander Lopez arranged the details in absolute secrecy, feeding Roger just enough false information to believe his plan with Shawn Battles remained hidden. 3 nights later, scouts confirmed Shawn Battles' forces moving toward the eastern pass, exactly where Roger's letters had promised they'd find an unguarded border. Instead, they found the Dominion's full army waiting in the tree line, and at the front of it, standing in the open with no weapon in her hand, Layla. Shawn Battles rode forward first, a scarred, broad man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him by miles. "A girl," he said, looking at Layla with open contempt. "Roger promised me an open border, not a fairy tale." "The border was never open," George said, stepping out from the tree line with Commander Lopez at his side. "It was bait, the same way you were bait for a traitor who was never loyal to you either." Shawn Battles' eyes flicked toward the ridge, where Roger Cannon sat frozen on his horse, caught between two forces he'd tried to play against each other. "Kill them," Shawn Battles ordered, and his men surged forward. Layla didn't scream this time. She sang, the old words rising steady and clear across the open field, and just like at Thornfall Field, every wolf within earshot felt their legs buckle beneath them. Shawn Battles' soldiers collapsing mid-charge, weapons falling from suddenly useless hands. Shawn Battles himself fought the pull with everything he had, snarling through gritted teeth as his knees finally gave out anyway, forced to the frozen ground in front of the entire eastern pass. "Bind them," George ordered, and Commander Lopez's soldiers moved through the fallen northern army, disarming them one by one while they remained too weak to resist. Roger tried to flee. He didn't get far. Jude, who had insisted on riding with the scouting party, cut off his escape route with 2 other soldiers, dragging him back to face the king he'd betrayed. The trial was held 3 days later, in the same throne room where Layla had once expected to be sentenced to death. Roger Cannon stood before the court, stripped of his title, the letter he'd written laid out on the table in front of him alongside a dozen more that Commander Lopez's soldiers had recovered from his eastern estate. Crystal stood beside him, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by the pale, brittle look of someone realizing exactly how much trouble she'd helped create. "You fed our patrol routes to an invading warlord," George said, his voice carrying the full weight of the crown for the first time since Layla had met him. "You gambled the lives of every soldier on that border for a chance at my throne. I did what was necessary, Roger said, though the defiance in his voice had thinned considerably. You were about to hand this kingdom's future over to an untested Omega with an unproven gift. That untested Omega, George said, just stopped a war you started, without spilling a single drop of blood. Meanwhile, you nearly handed my kingdom to a man who wanted to burn it. Roger had nothing left to say to that. Commander Lopez read the sentence aloud. Roger Cannon would be stripped permanently of his lands and title, exiled from the Dominion for life, forbidden from ever holding rank or influence in any territory again. Crystal, whose role had been limited to carrying messages rather than planning the betrayal itself, was given a lighter sentence, 5 years of labor in the border healers' camps, tending to the very soldiers her brother had endangered, with the chance to earn back a place in society once her time was served. You have a choice most traitors don't get, George told her. Use it well. Shawn Battles, who had led the invasion itself, faced the harshest judgment of all, a lifetime sentence in the Northern Territory's own reformed prison camps, stripped of any command. His fractured army absorbed peacefully into the Dominion's border patrols under Commander Lopez's watch, most of them relieved to finally answer to a structure that didn't demand endless raiding to survive. When the court finally emptied, Rick was the first to find Layla afterward, his flour-dusted hands squeezing hers with unmistakable pride. You did that, he said. An old baker and a scared girl in a chain line. And you're the reason this whole kingdom is still standing. We're the reason, Layla corrected gently. All of us. Nobody does something like this alone. Winter loosened its grip slowly, and with it, something in Layla loosened too. George found her in the palace gardens on a clear morning, the first real sunlight in weeks breaking through the clouds. He didn't bring a crown or a council or a single piece of kingdom business. He brought a small carved wooden bird, rough around the edges, clearly made by his own untrained hands. I'm not very good at this, he admitted, holding it out to her. Layla turned it over in her palm, smiling at the crooked wings. It's perfect. It's supposed to represent something? George said, oddly nervous for a man who had once faced down an invading army without flinching. A voice powerful enough to still an entire battlefield, and gentle enough to teach children how to read in secret. I wanted to give you something that showed both sides. George, Layla said softly. I know what I'm asking, he said before she could continue. A king marrying an Omega healer isn't a small thing in this kingdom. There will be council members who object. There will be territories that grumble. I don't care about any of that. I care about the fact that since the day you stopped an entire army from killing you with nothing but your own voice, I haven't been able to imagine my future without you standing somewhere in it. Layla felt the wooden bird warm in her closed hand. I spent my whole life being told I was less than everyone around me, she said. I'm not interested in a crown that changes that math for me alone. If I stand beside you, it has to mean something changes for every Omega in this kingdom too. Then we'll change it, George said simply. Together. Then yes, Layla said, and the kiss that followed was quiet and unhurried. Nothing like the desperate, frightened days that had brought them here. Everything like the calm, certain future both of them had chosen for themselves. The field where Layla had once knelt in chains looked nothing like it used to. The killing platform had been torn down within a month of the trial, replaced with a school built from the same black stone, where Omega children now learned to read openly, taught by Nancy, who had grown into one of the finest young healers in the Dominion. Rick's bakery, rebuilt twice as large as his old one, sat at the edge of the training grounds, feeding soldiers and children alike every morning. Jude had been given a permanent seat on the King's Council, the first former Omega assistant ever granted that honor. His careful eye for danger now protecting the kingdom instead of quietly warning one frightened prisoner in the shadows. Layla stood at the edge of the new school, watching Nancy help a small girl sound out her first full sentence, the same kind of lesson that had once cost Layla everything. George found her there, as he often did these days, a simple gold band on his finger that matched the one on hers. No iron crown between them anymore, just two people who had built something worth protecting. Any regrets? He asked, half joking, watching the children below. Layla smiled, thinking of the chain, the blood, the frozen road, the voice that had risen out of her without warning and changed the entire shape of her life. None, she said. Every hard step led exactly here. Below them, the small girl finished her sentence out loud, grinning with the kind of pride that no chain or charred sheet could ever take from her again. If Layla's story stirred something in you, if you found yourself hoping for her even in the coldest parts of that road, stay close, because there's more of this world worth telling, and I genuinely love to meet the people walking through it with me. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Thank you for spending this time in Layla and George's world. Stories like this one are built to remind us that kindness, patience, and the courage to teach someone to read in secret can matter just as much as any crown ever could.